Welcome to the program. My guest in this episode is Dr. Muhammad Ali Nasir, professor of economics at Leeds University Business School. We will discuss the forces that are reshaping business, economics, and global affairs, tackling the new age of tariffs, de-risking, and protectionism, and what it all may mean for growth, prices, supply chains, corporate investments, individual investments, government investments. Dr. Nasir, in addition to being professor of economics at Leeds University, is also the author of the book Off the Target, The Stagnating Political Economy of Europe and Post-Pandemic Recovery. Published in 2022, it was a deep dive into Europe's integration, the Eurozone's institutional design, and the post-pandemic policy lessons learned. His work spans macroeconomics, monetary and financial economics, the international trade and finance issues, with dozens of scholarly publications and a strong focus on how policy choices ripple through the real economy. Most recently, he's been analyzing the economic consequences of trade wars and the policy push towards friendshoring, including evidence on how tit-for-tat trade barriers can dent GDP while failing to deliver the intended domestic gains. We'll explore who really wins and loses from protectionist policies, how central banks may or should treat tariff-driven inflation, and what this all could mean for global productivity if the current trends persist. And we'll try to look into the crystal ball to see the likely scenarios for what comes next in global trade policy. You can get the political debate about the benefits or downsides of protectionism and trade policies that include tariffs and non-tariff barriers anywhere. There's dozens of podcasts that will do that. We'll leave the political debates to others. This is an academic conversation looking back through history at practical examples of times like this that we're experiencing now as we record this program in late 2025. And we also will explore the dynamics that are underlying these policies, which go beyond simple trade and fiscal issues, but into technological evolution, into demographic trends and challenges, and into the trends of global economics in general to become more regional in nature than the global realities that have persisted for some time. So Dr. Nasir was generous with his time. We covered a lot, and we hope you'll enjoy this episode. We hope you'll find it interesting and informative, that you'll learn something new. And our goal of this conversation is not to promote any particular point of view, but to opine and to reflect on historical examples and academic theory that can help inform your thinking and allow you to make better policy judgments for yourself, but importantly, to ask the right questions of your leaders and even of your own community. So we present my conversation with Professor Muhammad Ali Nasir, professor of economics at Leeds University Business School. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to begin today with a couple of base definitions. So as we get deeper in our conversation, everybody has a common understanding of what we're talking about. We're going to use the words protectionism a lot, probably in this show. And I think people are fairly familiar with tariffs, given the policies of recent years, but maybe less familiar with non-tariff trade barriers. So let's begin with protectionism, your definition of it, and how that relates to non-tariff trade barriers.
Yeah, so protectionism, as the name suggests, is basically a policy of protecting your domestic industry and your national industry and your local businesses from competition from abroad. And in so doing, then you adopt a trade policy which could entail uh, barriers or measures such as tariff, which is a tax on imports coming to your country, or you could take measures which are non-tariff measures, or you can have some barriers uh, on the entry of imports to your country in which you don't impose tariff, such as, for instance, you can put a quota. So for instance, if we are in the US, we are thinking that, okay, we are facing a competition from automobile industries from Japan, we can limit the number of cars coming to US which are made in Japan. So that in so doing, we don't need to put any tariff on the Japanese car. We can just limit the numbers, and that would be a non-tariff measure, which we call quota. We can limit to the number, and we can sometimes also put other sort of restriction. For instance, we can say, okay, well, you can only bring the products which have these specification, or you can impose quality standards. It should comply with the American quality standards, and obviously that would be a barrier for the Japanese come to enter the in the U.S. markets. So we can also introduce some bureaucratic rules, or they could be licensing requirements, etc., etc. So there are tariff barriers in which we can put a tax. We can say, okay, we're going to impose 25% tariffs on Japanese car coming to US, or we can then do all sort of other things which does not involve tariffs, but they could be non-tariff barriers. Collectively, these are different forms or different instruments of protectionism.
So, as we think about the value of these tools for
Yeah,
policymakers,
yeah,
um, there are many tariff regimes around the world. There are many non tariff trade barriers. There are
yeah,
some that protect sensitive industries, and then there are others that feel a little bit more capricious. From
yeah.
your view, is there a place in economic policy for protectionism? Is there a case to be made that there can be benefits to it? Because much of what we hear about are the negatives, the
Yeah,
impact on price, inflation,
yeah,
competitiveness.
yeah,
But if you were advising, policymakers, are there
yeah.
times and places where these policies are appropriate?
Yes, there could be exceptions. There could be limited cases where, for instance, there's an industry which is very crucial to national interest. For instance, defense industry. So you would like to protect your local defense industry, because if the international competition wipes that out, and you think like buying weapons or defense equipment from abroad is cheaper and you don't produce at all, and you think the international suppliers are more competitive and we should have open trade in arms, etc., and then push comes to shove, you are in a war with a country, and at that point your supply stop. So, for the defense purposes, there a case could be made. Similarly, for instance, health sector, you want to ensure that your citizens have good medicines, good quality medicines. So you would ensure the quality of medicines coming to your country. And for that reason, also you would like to you could impose some tariffs or non-tariff barriers, or you can ensure that your local pharmaceutical industry is in good shape. If you are in a scenario like we had COVID, in that type of situation you may need vaccines, and for so that there could also be a case there. So there could be definitely situations where you can use a limited amount of protective measures, but I think by and large, usually, generally speaking, we should not have a very high trade barriers, and broad protectionism is not really a very good thing for the local economy or global economy. But in some cases, I can see that we could always make a case. And sometimes when if you have what we call infant industry, you have an industry which is nourishing, which is an initial stage. It is an infant industry, and you may make a case that there could be some support from the local government to support that industry. One, it is on its feet and it can compete internationally, then you can take your hands off. So yeah, there are some arguments in favor of selective protectionism, but most of the economists agree that uh, the protectionism which we are observing recently, they are thinking too extreme sort of protectionism, and that's not very helpful.
So I think one of the things that gets lost in this conversation is that the global economy is different than it was in the past. And so we can
Yeah,
look back upon any number of examples of trade wars or tariffs being installed by certain countries around the world. But the global economy is different in 2025 as we're recording this show. There's far more movement of goods, services, and people across borders than there ever have been before. So,
yeah,
in today's economy, in today's interconnected global economy, big sections of which are service driven and digital driven, How do you view the utility of these old policies that were really designed for an industrial era of physical goods and services? How should we be thinking about those case studies of the past in the context of today's global economy and where it will affect, let's say, growth and inflation, given how much of international exchange is actually service oriented as opposed to goods oriented?
Yes, yes, that I mean that's a good way to look at it. I mean, one could argue that if you are making policies looking at the past, which might be suitable for an economy of 1950s and 60s, they are not really helpful if you have a forward-looking view. So if you are, I mean, take US, I mean, more than 80% of your economy is services based, and now if you think you're gonna have protectionist policies and you're gonna put tariffs on a lot of goods coming to the US from other parts of the world, I don't think it would be sensible to expect that we could revive the industry, or US can be industrialized the same way it was in 1950s and 60s, and then the nature of industries would also be the same which we had in those years. I think it'd be better if we look at the future and see what sort of industries would be there in the next 30 years or so, and what sort of skill set we need for those industries. So then we can invest in those industries which are the industries of the future. So which would be very different, which would be more sophisticated, more high tech. You need a different set of skills, you need different labor for those industries, and of course I mean you will have to invest in your skills and education accordingly, keeping in mind the next 30 years. So yeah, that is true, I think, to a large extent, that we can't really base our policy looking at the past, but we should have a view which is more to do with next 30, 40 years. And looking at countries like, for instance, in East Asia, we can look at examples like China, Korea. They had a view of the future, and they adopted their industrial policy accordingly. And now we can see that they can benefit of that. In EVs, China is doing great, and I think that's because they saw that EV revolutions coming, or electrical vehicle revolutions coming, and they grasp that in time. So I think that should be, I think, the focus of policy.
Now, there's also been a lot of talk about how the average citizen will experience the trade disruptions, whether they are tariff related or if there are restrictions on imports or even restrictions on exports. And a lot of debate in the United States, in particular, around whether you're going to see that show up in consumer prices, in corporate profits, in a combination of the two. Who is going to be hurt the most? And how are they going to feel it? I think one of the challenges is it's not always immediate. It's the sort of
Yeah,
issue that creeps in over time, and you may not
yeah,
be able, as an average Joe, to look back over 2 years and see what was the inflection point.
yeah.
As an economics expert, where do you expect to see the impacts most acutely, and how long does it take from a changing trade policy to the practical effects for somebody who's going out and living their life?
Yeah, so the policy which is going on at the moment, and specifically since the start of the current administration, um, uh, one thing is that there's a lot of uncertainty, because usually the trade is a subject, and the trade policy is a subject where we pour a lot of thought and effort uh, in making the policy, and then we see, okay, and the changes are usually very gradual. So we make a policy and we say, okay, we're going to impose tariffs on this specific sector, and that is the strategy. But since start of this year, we have seen that a lot of different policy measures being taken and withdrawn in a sometimes same day. Some a policy is announced, and then it is taken back. So this has created a lot of uncertainty. So one thing what I really call a cancer for the economy is uncertainty. No investor will invest when we have such a high level of uncertainty. So that is a big problem, and this has been reflected in the market, in the stock markets across the world. which reacted very negatively to different announcements during this year. Now, how it gonna affect the common man? Of course, if we look at the impact of the tariff, one thing we're gonna expect, and most of the economists and economic analysis, including what we did here at Leeds, suggest that there will be increase in the inflation. And if you look at the last few months since April, in United States, inflation, which was going down, now it started to increase again since April, and it started to increase very gradually. But in looking at the last few months, it's been increasing. And one thing we did notice that the prices of goods, they are increasing more than, let's say, housing cost, and that shows that these are due to the tariffs. We also expect the economy to slow down. There are different estimates. Our own estimates suggest that the impact of tariff on the US economy would be about half a percentage of GDP growth in the United States in over the next year only. And of course, thereafter there will be negative impact too, and GDP will never revert back to which it would have been had there been no tariff. So that would be output losses. But there are other think tank like Peterson Institute. They put out their analysis, and they are also suggesting that there will be negative impact on the US economy of about 0.6% this year. And for the benefit of your listeners, what is mean by if there's a point six negative impact on the United States economy? So let's say United States economy is roughly around 30 trillion US dollars. So if you are talking about point 0.6, perhaps you are talking about 240 billion US dollar losses in terms of GDP output, and that is a lot of money on the whole as an economy. US could suffer in terms of inflation. We could They are suggesting, the Peterson Institute I'm quoting, they are suggesting that the inflation would be about 1% higher. So you'll pay on average about 1% more for the things you are buying day to day basis. So, of course, that would put a squeeze on the income of the household and the consumer in the US. And there would also be a negative impact on the unemployment, and specifically those sectors which I think the current administration has a very strong base. For instance, agriculture sector or mining or manufacturing sector, they're gonna be affected negatively. There could be perhaps more unemployment in these sectors. So instead of helping, it would really hurt those sectors of the economy which we argue that will be helped by this policy. So this is kind of a bleak outlook which I can portray it, and I would say that most of the think tank and the economist, they are not really far from what I am suggesting, and the consensus is that there are negative impact. There would be negative impact on labor market in the form of increased unemployment, less GDP growth or economic growth, and higher prices.
So let's talk about the inflation dynamic for a moment, because there's a lot of conversation around whether and in today's economy. Well, again, we'll separate this from the historical examples versus today's. There are those who argue that yes, there'll likely be inflation, but that it'll be a one-time adjustment, and then the levels of inflation will level off. There are others who say that tariffs start a chain reaction that becomes difficult to stop unless the central banks step in. What is your view on the impact that these trade policy changes have on inflation? Do you believe that there's a one time adjustment and then a leveling off? Or is it your research and your view that it sets off a series of events that inflation won't slow until a central bank intervenes?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this inflation, which is induced by the trade policy, if you say that pushes the prices up by, let's say, 1%, then had there be no trade policy shock, the price is not going to come down. So prices will stay there. And now, if one could argue that, okay, well, let's say the prices stays there, okay, we buy that argument, income will catch up. But if your economy is not doing good and it's not growing, and your unemployment is also expected to increase in the coming months, which mean you should not expect that the wages will go up very fast, because when there's more unemployment, there is a lesser incentive for the employer to pay you more. So that mean that those impact would be permanent. So the increase in the inflation, if you have, even if you have one time, with the decrease in your economic growth and increase in your unemployment, you're not gonna catch up, or you're gonna be compensated for that loss in your real income. So therefore, we are expecting that this, unless the trade policy is reversed and more, um we have a policy which is more open, and then also there's investment by the government into different sectors of the economy, which could then compensate these losses. There would be permanent losses, and once you are off the trajectory which you had, it's not, you will have to then run a lot faster to catch up with the same trajectory you would have been otherwise. So I will take this argument with a pinch of salt, that this is something which is one time, or the negative impact on the U.S. economy or the consumer is just for 1 year. Then we would be where we would have been if there been no tariffs and no trade war.
And then the same holds true for the idea of what a higher price environment and potentially slower economic growth produces for workers. So there are many in the trades who would argue we understand there's going to be higher inflation and we understand there may be higher prices, but it will be better for us because there will be more job opportunities, which will create more wages in our sectors. Can you give us any examples of sectors where protectionist measures may actually create the benefit that those who are proponents of these policies they promote these? I mean, are there actually industries where it can be a positive, even if it is a net negative for the economy as a whole? It can do benefits in certain pockets.
Yes, there could be benefit. For instance, if you think that renewables, I mean, we know there's a demand for that, and if that specific sector, the government could provide protection, and then it could invest more, there could be more jobs in that area. So I think renewable is a straightforward area where you can see. And same with, by I say renewable, that also mean EVs to some extent in the US. But then they would we will also yet to see that how much investment is going. The pledges being made that there be more investment, but whether that investment is in which sector it is going, is it going more into AI and those sectors, and if it's going more into AI or high tech, uh, I mean, then that is a uh, small fraction of the your labor pool. uh, so I don't think average person, or they're gonna, that those sectors gonna create large scale employment. Just the nature of sector that you have, you need very niche skills and you need very few people to work in those sectors. So yeah, there could be examples, as I said, in case of uh, renewables, there could be one example. But in some cases, as I said, there is a negative impact too. So for instance, your agricultural sector, if you get into the trade war and then you have higher unemployment in that sector because people are not buying your soybeans. So I think those losses would be a lot larger and manifold than if you could create some employment in some specific sectors, which could do, which you can do anyway. As I talked earlier about looking at the future of the jobs and what sort of employment skills will be needed, or what sort of job we would have in the next 30 years, those areas you can invest anyway and you can increase your employment. And if you needed a little bit of protection there, you could perhaps you can perhaps do that without getting into any sort of trade tension or trade conflicts.
One of the interesting things about this episode in 2025, at least, of the trade shifts, the United States has unilaterally taken a lot of steps to increase their trade barriers. We haven't seen a ton of retaliation, China notwithstanding. The European Union, even the United States neighbors, instituted some retaliation and then backed off much of it. And in some cases, countries just sort of let it slide and really started looking at alternatives rather than getting to a direct confrontation. This feels a little unusual in historical terms. In fact, I remember as this was being talked about in the past years, the concern was that, well, if the US or another country were to unilaterally start, lifting trade barriers, others would immediately retaliate just reflexively. We haven't necessarily seen that. It's been a more thoughtful response.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate that can hold, or do you think there will be pressures, internal pressures in these countries to retaliate, even if it may not be in that country's economic best interest?
Yes, I mean there's a political side to it, and in the case of China, I think there was a Chinese are very sensitive to any sort of humiliation or saving the face. So they had a whole century of humiliation. So there's definitely a political side to it, and how your domestic audience sees it. We did do some analysis at Leeds, in the University of Leeds, in the earlier days of trade war and soon after the Liberation Day. And our analysis showed that if you retaliate, then the costs are even higher for the domestic economy as well as the global economy. So, in the case of United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement, or in the case of the UK and European Union, or also in the case of China and US, the trade wars, if you retaliate against the US mayors, that increases the cost, overall cost for your economy and for the US economy and for the global economy. In the case of the EU, we did see that there was some retaliation, although it was very measured, and there was reluctance to retaliate. I mean, we also understand that the EU are 27 countries, so them coming together and then trying to retaliate or to formulate a coherent response takes more time. In the case of UK, for instance, we thought the tariff on us were like 10%, and uh, we could somehow negotiate that with the US, and we had a significant surplus in the services. So we didn't want to retaliate and make this situation worse. Whereas in the case of China, yes, they did retaliate very strongly, and there's uh, although China didn't want to get into this, and they have said this many times that they don't want trade war or any trade tension, but they retaliated like before in the previous Trump's regime. Their responses are more measured. For instance, they target those industries in the US, or those sectors. For instance, they target agriculture sector, and they don't, which affects the American farmers. Among them, I think there is a lot of support for Mr. Trump. So their measures, they take these factors into account, and China being a big exporter, they also see whether their measures would have some impact on their raw materials. So if China is importing something which would be used in the production process, if they impose blanket tariffs, that will increase the cost of their imports, which will then be difficult for their local producer, who is going to then process that material, and then they will try to sell it. So in some cases, a clever policy could be where you have a cascading tariffs, where you don't put tariffs on your imports, but perhaps maybe you impose tariffs on your finished goods. So you encourage processing and value addition domestically. So yeah, coming back to your question, I think I kind of a little bit deviated from that. Yes, in some cases countries have to balance the political pressures as well as the economic realities and economic pressures. So different countries stands at different position in that. And in the case of EU or Canada, being a close ally and NATO members, I think the many EU countries, they were reluctant to get into fight with the US. And I think to some extent they might have anticipated that these measures perhaps it could have some political motives too. And the current administration probably you are is using that as uh, instruments of politics. So in that case, it'd be better to have some diplomacy and some give and take, and find some sort of settlement. And then we did see that that happened. I mean, they've been deals with the EU, with Japan and other allies, and some reconciliation in the trade war front. So yeah, I think their strategy was different from some countries like China.
So, one of the things we have to look back on over now 30, 40 years is for a long time, the benefits of global free trade were touted, and there were many benefits, and countries around the world did much better, and the United States was chief among them. But it's clear now that there were certain segments of the population, many working class people, who truly didn't benefit, were left behind. We did see some meaningful shifts in economic output in certain regions, and it eventually led to a political reckoning. What are some of the lessons that you and maybe your colleagues take from that period of time where we saw strong global growth and on paper things looked good, but somehow the numbers missed an underlying challenge that ultimately overthrew the entire system?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, Brian. I can't agree more. But I would say, I mean, it's hard to say what would be counterfactual because counterfactual does not exist. And there's been benefit to the global economy, that there been benefit to the overall economy of the United States and many other countries. But there are many people who are left behind in this globalization drive which we had in the last 40 years until we had this trade war. I think this is more to do with the failure of the the public policy and the failure on the social policy front, where in the countries, including I think in the US, the inequality has increased a lot in the last few years. And if we look at the income of, let's say, top 1% or top 10%, and compare to the bottom 10 or 20 or 50%, whichever way you like to dice it, we can see that the disparity has increased a lot, and median income didn't increase significantly in the last few decades. So for a lot of working class people, there's been no improvement in their lives. And in fact, there's been in some cases situation worse for got worse for many people. But I would say that is really a failure of focus in terms of the public policy and the domestic, I think I would say, social policy, where this change during this change and move towards globalization uh, was not tackled due to maybe a number of reasons in uh, some of the countries, including the United States, where I think uh, the distributional policies, they were not adequate or appropriate, And I mean, a lot of people have written on inequality, but I think there there is definitely a failure there. I think which explain resentment among the population and a big chunk of population, and perhaps when we did see the increase in the popularity of popular leader, or what some people call increase in populism, uh, and maybe more voters turning toward either far right or far left leaders to find answers to their problems and solutions to the issues they face, which are usually socioeconomic problems. So I think the problem is really there, that the division of the pie, I think that has not been fair, and I think that needs addressing without any further delay. I mean, United States is a very powerful country with over 30 trillion economy. It has a lot of resources, so I think maybe yeah. A better choice would be probably rethinking our public policy, and I think helping those people which are left behind in the society. Yeah,
So, also, what's been in the news more recently is the role of the central bank. Now, that's
yeah,
been a pretty significant discussion in the United States, the independence of the central bank, the influence that politicians can have on it. But countries around the world have central banks. The European Union has the ECB. What do you think that the central bank leaders are looking for in the data to determine their reactions to all of this? Because if their primary in the United States, the primary objective is maximum employment and a modest level of inflation, but all over the world, countries are impacted differently by this evolving trade environment, and it doesn't feel like there's an easy playbook, a predictable measure of when and how to adjust your interest rate policy. Quantitative easing is still in the lexicon. So, as a expert in this space, what are you looking for from the central banks, and what are the questions you think they're asking to try to determine how they react to this rapidly evolving global economic picture?
yes. So the central bank independence has been a topic which is, I mean, is quite interesting. And I one thing I must mention that this is not something really new. I mean, in the Britain, the central bank or Bank of England was established, I think, in 1664. So it's been more than, I think, 350 years since we had the central bank, and there's been period when the central bank was private even, and then it was nationalized, and it went through different stages. So countries have central banks which are there for hundreds of years, and they've tried different models of central banking. So in terms of central bank independence, in my interaction with different central bankers and attending various meetings, including those held at central banks, the central bankers, of course, would like to be more independent so they can discharge their duties without any pressure, and they can work to achieve the targets or objectives, which could be either keeping the inflation at a certain level, let's say 2 or 3% a year, or to if they have a dual objective on keeping the unemployment low and inflation also low, they endeavor to achieve those two objectives and try to strike a right balance which can yield the lowest possible unemployment and lower inflation. So central bank would definitely like to have independence. Uh, in my view, I think there's a degree to which the central banks are independent, or they can formulate their policy independently. However, actually, many years ago, when I did my PhD, that was on the coordination of the central bank policy, and which is the monetary policy, and the fiscal policy, which is the policy of the treasury. So, coordination of monetary and fiscal policy. And at that point, the conclusion of my thesis which I think still holds, is that there needs to be coordination and good coordination between monetary policy or central bank policy or the government policy, which is the fiscal policy. Whenever there is a conflict, then there is usually an outcome which is not a happy one. So, coordination between the central bank and the administration is very, very important. And whether you achieve that coordination where the central bank is completely independent and they've been given independence in terms of whichever policy they make, whether they increase the interest rate, increase the Fed rate, or decrease the Fed rate, it is the instrument they can use free from any sort of pressure, or whether they are working very close and in love with the government. The main thing is if they have good coordination and the policy is made keeping in mind the both the short term and long term stability in terms of prices and the economic stability. I think that always yields positive outcome. So what happened, for instance, in the case of the U.S. in last few months, where there's been some tension between the administration, presidential administration, and the central bank head. I think that was not very helpful. That was creating some uncertainty in the market, and that was creating a lot of some noise that what would be the central bank stance in this scenario or in this situation. So I'm a big proponent of good coordination between the central bank, uh, and I think even if you give them independence, central banks are never independent of like uh, everything, because even if they make policy independently, they set the interest rates very low or very high. Whatever would be the stance of the government or the fiscal policy, that would have bearing on the central bank's monetary policy. So if the central bank is increasing the interest rate and the government is running huge deficit, then it will not work well together. It would have then consequences for inflation and the economy. So even for the central bank to achieve their objective, they need support from the government. And for the government, it is also important that they have support of the central bank. So, in a nutshell, I would say that the coordination and collaboration, that is very important. If you have independence, like in the case of UK, we have made the Bank of England independent since 1997. The Bank of England has an inflation target of 2%, and they are free to use the instrument by increasing the interest rate or decreasing the interest rate, or doing the large scale asset purchases, which we call quantitative easing, if needed, by buying and selling the assets to influence the inflation or the price level. But even then, there is a representation of treasury on the in the central bank, and there's coordination and their arrangements are there, that there is a good coordination between the two, because if there's a conflict, that is not good for the economy and that is not good for the either of the policymaker, central bank or the treasury.
And this is a slight deviation from the main topic of trade, but on the topic of central banks and their targets, I've heard more conversation recently about whether it's time to update that 2% target, not just in the United States, but perhaps around the world, that structurally the economy is changing and 2% may not be realistic. Do you subscribe to that view that maybe it's time to relook at that target?
Yes, this actually debate became a bit more popular recently when we have a higher inflation recently, when in inflation in some countries went above double digit. But I can recall that maybe about 10 years ago or 12 years ago, when we have a bit more deflationary period and inflation was below the target. And at that point, there was also debate that whether we should change the target. I mean, I would say that what is the target if you keep changing it? Okay, so we can't change the inflation target too frequently. That is something very important. When Bank of England had its target, I think they had a 2.5%, probably, if I'm not wrong, and then we fine tuned it to 2%. So depending on the economy, your economic fundamentals, you could have different targets. Some countries may have 3%, some countries may even 4% inflation target. But whatever target you have, you can't change it too frequently. So I think in the current climate, uh, I would say in the case of the UK, I think if we have a 2% target, I think that's okay to keep. If we change it to 2.5%, that would not really be a big change. And if you change it too much and take it to 4% or 5%, that would be a radical change then. And that's what we call anchoring the expectations of investors and the people, because then they will have to then recalibrate their models and their view of the inflation and the central bank policy. So we can't really change the target too frequently. I mean, if there's a debate, we can then analyze the situation and we can then set the target. Then we'll have to communicate to the public and the financial sector and the banks and all the participants of the economy that this is the target and we're going to stick to it and we're not going to change it for the foreseeable future. This is something we can't do very often. So I am always a little bit careful about the idea. I take it with a pinch of salt whether we should change the inflation target or not. This is not something we can do very frequently.
All right, back to on the global trade issues. So we have the World Trade Organization. We have,
Yeah,
in theory, rules based order.
yeah,
Obviously, we have now the biggest economic participant, the U.S., arguing that all of this led to, in their words, unfair, unbalanced trade, ripping off of some countries, whatever all of the political semantics are around it. It is fairly clear that the multilateral institutions weren't able to meet the moment when one of the biggest participants in them chose to step back. So, do you feel like the WTO and the rules order around global trade need to be reformed to, again, reflect a modern reality, modern economics, modern demands? Um, and what do we need to do to ensure that there are ways to manage disputes when member nations maybe legitimately have them?
yeah, yeah. No, that's an interesting aspect. So, uh, WTO has become less significant in the recent years, and as we saw that most of the disputes are now resolved on bilateral basis rather than the WTO, and I think they are resolved swiftly when they are resolved on bilateral basis, and this is also an indication of something more profound, and that is that we are not operating in a unipolar world now. So we have, if we look at the global world map, we have the areas like, for instance, take the ASEAN region. So that has the regional dynamics, and there are new players in that area which don't have a political mass, but they also have economic mass. And same in the Europe, we have EU as a player. So we have a world which is, I would say, multipolar. And in this world, and then we also have, I think, to some extent, Latin America, that itself is a block. So we have these multipolar world in which there are a few poles, big and small, and centers of gravity. And in that environment, it is really hard to then unite all the countries around the world with their domestic or regional trade dynamics and trade connections into a bigger hub. So the picture, therefore, is now looks like that you have regional agreements, you have bilateral agreements between the countries depending on their trade relationships and the significance and strength of their trade relationships, and then this everything gets connected into a global network. So I think that is the reality of it. Of course, it would have been great if we have a rule based system which is global and international, but I think we have really a new rule book with many regional chapters, and collectively this is a kind of collection of things. And be realistic, I would say that is the manifestation of the multipolar economic order which we are seeing in the 2025. And perhaps that is, there are good things to it, there are bad things to it. One of the good thing to it is that one single country couldn't influence uh, the whole world. And the trade war which was started, it was, I think, most of the world, or well, most of the countries around the world, they didn't agree to it, and they didn't really had it been a unipolar world, I think, well, maybe you wouldn't have to start a trade war. But if you had started, the outcome would have been very different. And given that the escalation stopped soon after it started, that is also maybe a positive sign or positive aspect of a multipolar economic world. Yeah, I think if we be realistic, I think that's the world we live in now. And going forward, perhaps if we can refine that word, make it more peaceful, I think that would be win-win.
So where does that multipolar economic world leave a developing economy? Let's take the nations of sub-Saharan Africa. Let's take some of the countries you mentioned, Southeast Asia. There's plenty of examples around the world. Could this be a benefit? Does it require them to look more regionally and develop much more localized supply chains and trade relationships? How do you think about that for lower income countries that are still trying to get into the middle income and upper income echelons?
Yeah, yeah. So indeed, I would say there are benefits of that to the different regions and the developing economies, are the term we use, the global south. So there are benefits for the global south. And if we look at, for instance, Africa, now we look at China, Chinese trade with the Africa in the first half of this year has increased about 20% in the first half of this year as compared to year before. So while the trade with the US declined, Chinese trade with Africa, Chinese trade with ASEAN, that increased, and the Chinese trade with Latin America, that increased over 7% in the first half of this year as compared to 2024. So the global south is, I think, is in a lot better shape than it was, say, 20 years ago. If you look at the regions, there are not many conflicts or geopolitical tensions going on in these regions, as I think there historically been. So I think by and large, political landscape or situation is more peaceful, and I think good for investment. And while United States is disengaging to some extent, I think these countries in the global south, there is a very clear understanding that they need to trade with each other and they need to focus more on development. And I think China has made good ground in that space, and I would say other uh, developing countries or countries from the global south, they have also made more ground in these in the space left by the Western countries or Western powers. So, so therefore, there are also regional institutions and the development banks too. I think in the last few years they've been increasing their footprint. So definitely, those countries, I would say, are gaining in this situation, and it's not that they are stopping because the United States has decided to slow down or stop.
So, as you look to the future, do you believe that history tells us that the protectionist fever will break at a certain point and there may be a movement back towards a more free trade environment? Or do you think the base case is that we're going to be in this period of protectionism for some time to come?
Well, I don't think we would be in this period of protectionism for very long. I mean, we could look at what happened from the beginning of this year and specifically since the 2nd April and the Liberation Day. I mean, at one point, US tariffs on China were, I think, reaching on average about a 145%. And I mean, they are still very high, but from those levels, they have come down very significantly. And um, a- and there's nobody really. I mean, even if we look at the administration, they would say, well, actually we are responding to something which we think is unfair, and we want a settlement, maybe on our terms, but we want a settlement. We don't want to be in the status quo, or we don't want to exist in this world where there are high tariffs. It's only that we are doing because we've been treated unfairly, whether they are right or wrong, but that is not the argument. So it's there's nobody who really wants that high tariff regime to prevail for a very long time. But I think this uh, uh, idea of the trade war, I think it's running out of the steam, and uh, going forward, I think we would have maybe less protectionism. But I must acknowledge that once you put these measures in place, it becomes difficult to then liberalize the trade or reduce them. For instance, in the case of US China trade war, we know that, and I actually said this in the earlier days of Biden administration. I was interviewed by a Korean television, and I also have a piece which is available on the World Economic Forum. I think in January 2021 it was published probably. And I argued that whatever measures being taken under Mr. Trump administration, I'm talking about the first term of Mr. Trump, those measures would not be unfolded, or those restrictions would stay in place. And it would even the under the Biden administration, the trade war doesn't increase escalates further, it will stay where it is. And actually that happened, and there are political dimensions to that too. But the current levels are, I think, a bit too high. So I see that in coming days there would be some liberalization, not where we are now, because where we are now the costs are quite high. And as I said earlier, the inflation started to increase again, and the projections are that it will weigh on the US economy in the cost of hundreds of billions of dollars every year. And I think the costs are a bit too high. So I expect that there would be some sort of settlements between the US and China, and also between the US and its North American partners, Mexico and Canada. I would see there would be hopefully resolution, resolves, and settlements in coming months. So yeah, maybe I would say next few months are very important, and I'm hopeful there will be some resolve to the situation. Yeah, and trade peace.
All right. So my last question for you is actually the questions that you're asking. You're obviously looking at the global economic picture. You're looking at all the policies we've looked at today, and you have, I'm sure, questions of your own that you're pursuing and that you'd like to learn more about. So, what are those top one or two things that are on your mind? Maybe that you're actively researching, maybe that you and your colleagues are studying, that will be important for our listeners to follow in the months to come.
Yeah, so I mean, things we are currently looking and doing some analysis is, one is this, that when the US has imposed tariffs and the restrictions, where the countries are going. And I gave you some examples, and we also have done some analysis, and we found that the countries are looking elsewhere. And we're also trying to analyze that with these restrictions, how the global trade is diverting. And our analysis and our projections are that if these measures stay here for a bit longer or for significant amount of time, then the global trade will continue to flow, but it will flow maybe through different channels and different routes. So the process of I think globalization, uh, growth in the international trade, that would hopefully continue to evolve, and that will continue to increase. It only The question is in what magnitude and in what shape. That is something we are interested in, that we are also looking at. And also the new technologies, including the AI and other related technologies, how they're gonna shape the future of industry. And countries which have been affected by the trade war, how they are changing their ways of doing business. We did do some analysis on these things, and what findings we got are that those countries which, when the countries are faced with restrictions like that, then they become more innovative and they try to find solutions to the problems they didn't have before, but the crisis gave them an opportunity to come up with some new solutions to their problems. So yeah, I think there are some silver linings to this cloud of protectionism, dark cloud of protectionism, which we try to look at. Yeah,
It gives us a lot to think about and a lot to look forward to, and maybe we'll
yeah,
have you back to talk about those trends as they become clear. You've been very generous with your time today. If people would
my
like to
pleasure.
learn more about you or they like to follow any of your work, do you have websites or social media accounts that people can follow?
Yes, indeed. I have a website which is institutional website at the University of Leeds. I'm in the Department of Economics, a professor of economics at University of Leeds. I'm also on Twitter. I don't tweet very regularly, but yeah, I do check my Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn. These are two social media I use. Sometimes I write for the Conversation UK, which is a kind of op-ed for the academics and researchers, sometimes for other outlets, and sometimes I speak to media. It's nice talking to you.
Yes,
I hope your audience would find this conversation informative, and I'll be very happy to talk to you again.
absolutely. All right, we'll put some of those links in the description of this program. Thank you very much for the time today, and we look forward to having you back again.
Thank you very much, Brian. Have a nice day.
If you're new to the podcast and our podcast community, we hope you find it refreshing that we don't tell you what to think. We don't assume we have all the answers. We don't promote that everybody follows one rigid ideological point of view. We bring on the smartest experts we can find, like Professor Nasir. We ask them the best questions we can think of, and we try to unveil and uncover deeper understandings of complex topics and issues that don't have easy answers. Economics is one of those areas. Global trade is one of those areas. I'd like to offer a few more things for you to consider about this topic that we didn't have a chance to cover in the interview or that came into my thinking as I was preparing for this and, frankly, while I was conducting the interview. So, one of the things that makes economics so fascinating to me, and global affairs for that matter, is how unpredictable it can be. And it's unpredictable because, well, there are people involved, and people are unpredictable. I don't know too many people with a deep academic background and a deep understanding of economic history and the history of geopolitics who would have predicted that when the United States initiated a tariff regime against most countries in the world, that there wouldn't be a significant retaliation from many of them. Taking aside the US China trade spat, many of the countries around the world chose a cooler heads prevail mentality that they didn't see a benefit to their own country from raising significant barriers to US trade. They would target selected industries that might send a message and maybe make a point, but didn't fundamentally retaliate with anything near what they were hit with. And the reason for this is because most of these countries determined that it wasn't in their interest to do so, that if the U.S. would pursue a tariff policy that potentially could even harm their own economy, why would they respond and retaliate with measures that would harm their own? Not many people believed that countries would be able to keep cooler heads and take this effectively broadside in stride and let it pass. There was also an underestimation of how quickly in the modern globalized world trade patterns could change very rapidly. That if a certain trade route or trade partner was cut off, that new trade partners would be able to replace them fairly quickly. And so we maybe should have learned that lesson after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when Europe went from importing huge amounts of energy from Russia to effectively none in a fairly short period of time. Something that the Russians even would have thought was completely unthinkable, and they believed this would be a key point of leverage for them against Europe. The United States may have also had a belief that its trade relationships were so critical to nations around the world that they were an indispensable trade partner, and therefore that using trade as leverage would have been a more powerful tool than it really ended up being. You could use the example of China establishing much more trade on soybeans with Latin American countries like Brazil, doing that very quickly and being able to move past the potential damage done by having tariffs instituted on the soybean trade between the U.S. and China. So these issues, these topics can be very unpredictable because you just never know how governments and the individuals who run them are truly going to respond. But I will offer another important perspective. Those who have been advocates for a more protectionist economic policy, not just in the United States, but around the world, have often cited that it's too narrow to look at just trade policy and not understand how it fits into a much bigger and broader economic vision. That if you only looked at trade policy and tariff and non-tariff barrier policies, some of the things that countries do might seem silly if looked at in a vacuum. But that we have to consider all of the issues and all the factors that affect an economy, and then you may have a different perspective on the use of these economic tools. So I reflected a little bit on that. And it was an important point to consider that there are underlying trends that make a significant difference to the future of economies all over the world. So, for example, we know we've covered on this podcast extensively the demographic evolution of modern industrialized Western nations. We know the demographic collapse that has already happened in some countries. Japan gets covered a lot, but many of the countries of Western Europe, with aging populations, fewer children paying into those systems, and countries that are struggling to figure out how they're going to grow when they have so many aged people who are unable to contribute significantly to the workforce and so few young people that can support that. Also in an era with backlash against immigration, which in many places around the world had been the way that countries were able to fill that gap. So these demographic realities have economic realities, and the restricting of immigration around the world compounds many of them. But these are two realities that have to be understood that are impacting economic policy around the world and economic growth. We also can't ignore technology. It's very critical to understand how companies have become more efficient through the use of technology and the hopes, if not expectations, that artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, and other advances that seem to be just around the corner may allow countries and individuals to be much more productive than they were in the past. And of course, productivity has a huge impact on economic growth. It could have a competitive impact on which countries can use these tools faster to make themselves more productive, even in an era of declining populations and minimal immigration. We don't fully understand how the technology will impact the economies of the world, but we hear trends that could go from relatively minor short-term productivity gains that allow countries to do more with fewer people to, let's call them, outlier scenarios where AI, robotics, quantum computing, and other technologies could replace half of the jobs that exist today. Not only replacing a gap because of a declining workforce, but actually starting to throw people into unemployment who would otherwise be working in these economies, completely changing the dynamics and the challenges facing countries. We can't ignore the fiscal realities of the world we live in. How much debt has been generated by governments around the world to fuel their spending? We can't ignore that there has been a significant increase in defense spending around the world, partially triggered by what's happened in the Middle East, but what's happened in Eastern Europe, the United States stepping back from its role as the police of the world, forcing countries to consider how they will defend themselves without the backstop of an American guarantee of their protection. We also can't ignore the energy revolution. Some countries around the world making significant advancements in solar and wind technology. The entire international community reflecting on how nuclear energy can and should be a bigger part of its future. The energy efficiency gains that have allowed oil and gas production to go further and to do more for us. And the increased energy needs that the new technologies like AI are requiring at the very moment that we're going through some of these energy changes and transitions. The truth is, none of us can predict how any one of these issues is going to impact the global economy. But now put all of these cross currents together, throw in trade policy on top of it, and truly, I don't think anybody has ever seen an era quite like this where they can draw a historical parallel and predict how it's all going to pan out. So, what questions am I asking myself if I keep in mind the topics of restricted immigration, of demographic collapse in some countries around the world, of increased fiscal spending and debt and defense spending, of the advent and the dawn of a new era of productivity technology, of an energy revolution that we are in the midst of, compounded with all of the trade topics that we've talked about today? Well, there's two things that are most concerning to me. Number one is the potential for war to break out at a larger scale than it already has. All of these changes we just talked about are going to affect societies and countries in profound ways that we don't fully understand. And in some cases, they may turn to conflict as an answer to how to address them, especially if we see some countries take huge leaps forward in their productivity gains, their technology gains, and it allows them to begin to rival old powers faster than we previously thought they could. We also can't underestimate how all this defense spending around the world, active conflicts, are going to dramatically increase the efficiency of weapon systems and reduce the cost of war from a technological standpoint. That may make it more likely and easier as countries see fewer costs to conducting those types of operations. So I am concerned about that and how countries of the world would change and respond as a result of a larger conflict than those we've already seen initiated in Europe. But the bigger thing that I have some deeper reflecting to do on is what is the impact of all of these things on innovation and entrepreneurship? Because these have been the drivers of growth throughout the Western world and, frankly, much of the world as a whole. And the key to innovation and entrepreneurship has often been collaboration, sharing of learned lessons around the world. Some great scientific advances couldn't have happened in just one country without the exchange of ideas across borders. It's also true that innovation comes from testing and learning in multiple places, exchanging ideas, and having the smartest people in the world be able to move around that world so that they can work with other great minds and experiment in different ways. So if we end up lifting all kinds, or I should say debuting all kinds of new trade barriers, immigration barriers, and technological barriers that restrict the movement of people, it will also restrict the movement of ideas. It will also restrict the ability for those ideas to truly flourish and grow into commercially viable concepts. and that this could put a significant damper on entrepreneurship as a whole. That's a negative point of view, but there is a positive point of view. Because what if all of these challenges, what if forcing countries to look within themselves for their own talent, to force countries with limited resources that are getting thinned out by the day, forces them into productivity, forces them into innovation, requires people to elevate their thinking, and maybe technology that frees up more people's minds and hands to solve these problems rather than take care of the mundane activities of their daily life? What if all of this sparks an innovation and entrepreneurship revolution, forced by the dynamics of the environment around us and maybe incentivized by the very policies that could disrupt it by disrupting the movements of people? I think that there's a chance that entrepreneurship could flourish in a way that it hasn't before if the AI productivity tools of the future free up more minds and more hands to focus on building something new and different and using these tools to create a new world that solves new challenges. And you never know where innovation is going to come from, but I will say innovation comes faster in countries under stress than it does from those who are able to coast by. So I don't know which way it's going to go, but I hope that by offering all of these different perspectives and variables, it offers you a more global view of how trade is just one of many pillars that fit into the future of your country and of your business, of your community, of your society, and how it could impact all of us for the positive or potentially for the negative. And I'd love to hear from you which you think is more likely and how you see it all playing out. If you'd like to share your thoughts with me, the easiest way to do it directly is by email. My email is info@brianjmatos.com. But you can also find me on your favorite social media channels, and I do respond to those comments. You can leave comments on my YouTube channel. And of course, you can always find me on my website, brianjmatos.com. I thank you all for listening. I hope you'll share this program with others who you know who find these topics fascinating, and that you can use this as a catalyst for conversations in your own life. I look forward to talking to you again soon with another great episode just around the corner. And until then, I hope you will all stay curious.